Hello, I'm Julian Rush, and this is The Daily Planet. Solutions are top of the agenda today, and the options and opportunities for a very crowded planet. In the next half hour, we continue with that thorny subject of green economics. Everyone agrees it's essential, but how do you make it happen? How do we change the mindset of thousands of years devoted to getting rich in cash terms to one where wealth is defined by well-being and sustainability? Good morning from London. In this morning's programme, as well as greening economics, we ask, can the digital age, which has allowed social movements to drive fundamental political shifts like the Arab Spring, be harnessed to bring the changes needed for a more sustainable society? We hear about a remote community in Australia that's transformed itself to adapt to climate change, and I get to meet an astronaut who's got amazing ways of turning satellite data into powerful images that reveal how the planet works. So, green economics, how do we change the world's economies so they reflect all the different sustainability factors that aren't taken into account at the moment? Well, some interesting ideas are being explored, as you've heard, at this Planet Under Pressure conference. And to discuss them, I'm joined by Professor Anantha Duraiappah, the Executive Director of the International Human Dimensions Project, IHDP, by Bina Agarwal, the Director of the Institute of Economic Growth at Delhi University in India, and by Eyre de Boer, who I suspect is probably now having a slightly quieter life as an advisor to KPMG after several grueling years as the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. First of all, I mean, Ivo, changing this mindset that's been built up over thousands and thousands of years, kind of redefining, if you like, almost what self-interest is it actually something that we can do, that we can redefine what economics means?
I think we can, providing, as you say, we can redefine self-interest. If I look, for example, at the climate change negotiations, the conversation there all seems to be about less, and what people are not seeing is how it can actually be in their economic, their social, and their environmental issue to interest to shift the direction of economic growth in a more sustainable direction. So I think we need to come up with a new definition of more rather than focusing on less and making it clear how that could be better.
Do you have any idea what that definition might be?
I think by shifting growth in a more sustainable direction, I think that there is a great deal that businesses around the world can do to simply address their bottom line, to reduce cost on energy, on water, on waste. I think there are opportunities to put new brands and products into markets. So in that sense, I think there is a great deal that we can do that actually earns you money before we get to some of the thornier questions on how you use policy to shift the direction of growth.
Bina, how does these sorts of discussions play in the South, in the developing world, where very few people have, or a lot of people have very little? I mean, self-interest is more a matter of survival. Or is there a sense that we can learn something from the way people in the South and developing world are, some might say, in harmony with the environment? They know how to live sustainably because they have no choice.
Well, people learn to survive by cooperating because of interdependencies. So the idea that self-interest involves each person for themselves is actually an idea which neoclassical economics has pushed us to think about. But there's huge amounts of information and huge amounts of, there's been all sorts of experiments done by communities which we've learned from, which we know that the standard idea of the economics as self-interested man is no longer even accurate as a description of the way communities and people live and work. So there are examples of communities around protecting forests, around harnessing soils, replenishing groundwater, all of which we need. And the second is, I think green economics is not just about green growth, and I would say it's about green development. And that's not quite the same thing, because green development is a much more multidimensional concept. It is about the quality of life, of which growth can add to that. and is very important, but it doesn't tell you about the inequalities that underlie growth, which we also need to take into account.
Anantha, perhaps the elephant in the room here, and it's been brought up by one of the questions that's come in to the conference here, is the idea that perhaps we need innovative ways of doing politics. You know, it's finance ministries, it's treasuries, it's politicians who need to change their understanding. Is that redefinition of what we mean by politics actually what we need?
Well, that's a difficult question that you've just posed, but I think politicians, if you're looking at that particular group that you just mentioned, have a very short, myopic time perspective. And they are looking at, I think they're driven by the fact of this perception of what we think is an important aspect of this generic term that we call well-being. So I think there's a real need to redefine what we mean by well-being and how do we measure well-being. And you know, the Sarkozy initiative was one particular stuff. Let's go beyond GDP, because this gross domestic product, which just measures output. It doesn't really say anything about people's lives.
Yeah, that's been raised by one of the other questions. Should we have something like an equivalent, an eco-index, a bit like the FTSE or the Dow Jones or something like that, that every day is updated so we know how the world is going? Is that an idea that might fly?
I think the concept is important. I think in Bhutan they've been talking about gross domestic happiness as opposed to gross domestic product I've heard them talking about it for the past 20 years. I still think that the challenge is how can you make that real, understandable and appealing to people, to get back to your point on politics and your point on people. Actually, there's only one thing that you need to be an effective leader, and that's followers. And you will only have followers if you can develop an agenda that is of interest and understandable, comprehensible to the people that you are seeking to lead. And I think that that is part of the challenge that we face, that we focused very strongly in some discussions on the environmental dimension alone, but made it a lot less clear what it can mean for people in an economic and in a social sense as well. And I think the political challenge is to develop that agenda in a comprehensive way to give people something that they're willing to follow the politicians on.
Bina and Anantha, very briefly, each of you, what do you want Rio +20 to say about greening economics, about devising a new way of doing economics in a green and sustainable way? Bina.
Well, I think you need to look at a whole range of things. As I said, we need to look at green development. So food security comes into it, physical security comes into it, people's freedoms come into it, issues of social connection, social capital come into it, all the sorts of things. I was a member of Sarkozy Commission as well, and we looked at all of these. And it's really linking them up. So for instance, we know that social connections and a rule of law and legislative freedoms actually can help people participate better in the process of influencing policy and taking it in a direction which will improve their lives. I do want to add that single indices don't work always. It's like saying, let's add up the petrol, how much petrol you have in a car with the speed with which it is going. So you really need a range of indicators.
Stop you there because we're running out of time. Anantha, very briefly, in a word, what should come out of Rio +20 on the economic dimension?
I would say two levels. At a macro level, a new indicator, a macroeconomic indicator which goes beyond the GDP. And at the micro level, going towards at the individual level in working with the notion of access to opportunities, the freedoms that people have to achieve the life that they would like to have.
Thank you all very much indeed. I'm sorry we're out of time, but thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Now, imagine a world without satellites. They don't just mean that we can beam television signals or phone calls around the world or locate our position on the planet to within a few centimeters. For scientists, they've become an invaluable tool. But what do you do with all those terabytes of data that's streaming down from space? Well, at NASA, they turn them into the most amazing pictures. And I found out more in the exhibition hall here at the conference. Now, as you walk into the exhibition area of the conference centre, your eye is caught straight away by this extraordinary display, great bright display, which comes from NASA, data from space. And here to tell us all about it, are Piers, the former astronaut, now Director of Science and Exploration at the Goddard Space Centre, and Steve Graham from NASA. Steve, first of all, what is this display showing us that we're seeing now?
Well, this is our hyperwall. So this is one of our major outreach tools that we use to show off lots of different NASA data sets from a lot of our Earth science spacecraft. And so what we're looking at here is CWIFS data, which is measuring chlorophyll concentrations from space. So basically a measure of how green the land is and how much green and how vibrant the chlorophyll or the phytoplankton is in the oceans.
And what do you learn from that information? What does that tell us?
Well, this tells us the health of the ocean. So it basically telling us where the fish are thriving and where the phytoplankton are thriving, and also telling us where a lot of the greenness is around the world.
Piers, as a former astronaut, you will have seen some of this, I guess, from space. But when you see it like this, does it put what you saw from space in perspective?
Well, actually, in some ways, this is better and more useful than what I saw from space, however much fun that was. One of the things you can see on this speeded up set of images is the seasonal cycle of greenness over the planet. So you're watching this green wave every spring go up the northern hemisphere and come back down again. And we're looking at things like interannual variability, differences between years, and changes over the decades. Very powerful tool for looking at the health of the planet, as Steve said.
Are you beginning to see changes that show us that the health of the planet is deteriorating?
I wouldn't say deteriorating, we're seeing changes for sure. For example, we're seeing around in the land around the Arctic Basin, around the North Pole, significant green up compared to what there was before. And that's because, you know, we got rapidly increasing temperatures up around the Arctic region. And so it's getting greener there, and it's getting greener earlier and earlier every year.
Now, you talked about the Arctic there. One of the other animations you have is of the Antarctic. Perhaps if we can have a look at that, we can see what you can see there. This Antarctic animation, Steve, what does this show us?
Yeah, so this one here is data from satellites that have radars on board. And when you put a radar on a satellite, you can measure the velocity of the ice that's moving across the continent. And so the velocities here are color-coded to how quickly the ice is moving. And so the darker reddish and pinkish areas are the fastest moving ice flows, whereas the bluers are the slower moving ice flows.
Now obviously that's clearly speeded up, but that just shows you quite how dynamic the ice in the Antarctic actually is, doesn't it?
I know what's really beautiful about this is a couple of things. Is you can see the effect of topography over Antarctica, how you've got these watersheds where the ice goes this way on one side and down to the other side of the continent on the other side. And the other thing is, how else would you get these data? There's no other way to get this kind of understanding of how the ice shelf works in Antarctica except from space. You can't send 1 billion people out there with little measuring sticks to do this work. The only way to get this information is using satellite platforms. The
scientists at this conference are sending very, very strong warnings to the Rio+20 conference in June, just 86 days away. Without satellites like this, would we be in a position to be able to give the warnings that we can now give about the potential future the Earth faces?
Well, I think satellites are really important tools in the toolkit for understanding what's happening globally. This is the only way you can get consistent observations every day using the same instruments reliably. So we've been doing this for about 30 years so far, and we're picking up trends, there's no question about it.
Steve, without this, do you think this makes a difference, doesn't it?
This definitely makes a difference. The unique perspective of space is unsurpassed.
That's amazing stuff. I particularly thought the visualization of Antarctica was extraordinary, just showing how dynamic the continent is. Well, if visualizing satellite data has been a cultural shift for scientists around the world, just think what the cultural shifts are needed to embrace sustainable living. Social scientists are increasingly aware of just how difficult it is for societies and individuals to make those cultural shifts. It doesn't matter how loud scientists and other peoples shout about the dangers ahead, people in governments just don't seem to take any action. But unless those cultural barriers can be overcome, well, nothing will happen. One of the leading scientists working in this field is Kari Norgaard from the University of Oregon, who will be telling the conference more about her research tomorrow. And she joins me now. Kari, why do people, individuals, governments, communities do nothing in spite of loud warnings? What it is about us that makes us just sit on our hands?
Thank you. That's a very important question. I think it's one of the questions that's really driven my work for a while. My work comes from the place of looking at, the individual experience as a starting point, and very few people have looked at what is it really like in an experiential level to think about climate change? From the ethnographic and interview data that I have, it's clear that it's very scary, it's very disturbing. And so there's all of these negative and troubling emotions that come to play. Fear about the future, a sense of helplessness in the face of those problems, guilt if you're from a country where you have a really high contribution to this problem. And so in the paper that we're presenting here, which is related to my book, Living in Denial, Climate Change Emotions in Everyday Life, we are really emphasizing how those individual experiences of disturbing information, encountering that, are embedded in and reproduced by cultural practices through which people normalize those experiences. So conversation norms through which we kind of downplay or change the subject. On the one hand, are ways that we recreate a sense of normalcy, and also are kind of a barrier for people to engage further change.
Well, does that suggest that we perhaps have to change, like the scientists here at this conference, they have to change the way they send a message? Rather than appealing, if you like, to logic and fact, they need to put out some sort of emotional message that overcomes those emotions we were talking about of guilt and powerlessness.
I think that we do need to think about under what conditions can we respond as individuals, sort of as a collective and socially. I would say the question is a little bit different. We need to think about not just sort of trying to change a message to target individuals in a different way, but to understand that those individual messages are going to be received and interpreted in a cultural lens, and also through a larger discourse that's kind of keeping the system in place. So we can't just try to change through targeting the individuals, but we need to think about under what conditions can cultural change or larger structural change, the discourse at the larger level, under what conditions will that change? Because if we can do that, we can create a lot of change. Right now, the system is kind of being held in place by an inertia that's operating on different levels.
So it's like a tipping point is needed, isn't it? You need to overcome something like that.
Yeah, I mean,
can we learn anything from the past, from the way there's been big shifts in things like, I don't know, abolition of slavery, for example? I mean, is that a parallel that we can perhaps draw upon to chart a way forward?
One recent example in the United States that I think gives some indication of it, around the election of Obama, there was a lot of political mobilization that happened, and we saw a lot of young people who hadn't been voting were in the streets, and there was just a lot of mobilization, and it was around this sense of hope. Now, I know for many people that hope has not played out in the way they wanted, but nonetheless, that moment where we saw a lot of engagement was a kind of tipping point, and I think the sort of fear that people experienced was activated, and all of a sudden you saw a lot of mobilization.
Kari Norgaard, that's fascinating stuff. Good luck with your session tomorrow afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us on the Daily Planet. Now, we're going to stick with the theme of cultural shifts. One of the most fundamental of the last decade has been the rise of social media. It's looking as though it's becoming an extraordinarily powerful medium with an amazing ability to enable people to transform societies. Just think about how the Arab Spring, for example, and the uprisings were driven in no small part by bloggers and YouTube and Twitter. So can the power of the internet and social media be harnessed to drive governments, business and society as a whole to make the sort of cultural changes we're talking about just now and change the sort of changes that scientists at this conference are saying are so urgently needed? Well, a man who may have the answer is Andy Revkin, who writes the hugely influential .Earth blog for the New York Times. Andy, thanks for coming to see us today. Am I right? Does social media have this power to transform society and perhaps and make the changes happen, the sustainability changes happen that we so desperately need?
I think there's unbelievable potential. I think we're just in the early days of test driving this new way of communicating ideas. It's not just communicating ideas, it's sharing and shaping ideas. Communities can examine how to make a building safer in earthquake zones. They can examine strategies for more sustainable farming methods and share them in ways that just were not possible in the days of when something had to move by some other means. And then at the same time, the conventional media, like what I work for, are shrinking. So if we don't move this conversation and these idea shaping and sharing tools and skills and practices into these media, then we're missing a great opportunity. Why stay within the wedge of writing a press release when there's no one there to take the call.
Is there any evidence that it's beginning to happen already?
Oh, sure. I see it every day. One reason I left traditional journalism, I still blog every day, and moved to academia. I teach at Pace University. Is I see students capable of filling that gap. Just by, I'll give you one quick example from my own son, who's a sophomore at Pace University, did a graph, an animated version to illustrate how a Purdue University engineers designed for a safer building, how that would work. And without language, just with images, you could show a community in a developing country when they have access to the web, and of course they do more and more through phones and other technologies.
That's an important point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because to a degree, this technology, although it's penetrating developing world, is a rich world technology.
Yeah.
How important is it that the technology spreads to the developing world and can be harnessed in the developing world?
There's a fast-forward process underway right now that is bringing that connectivity to the world. There still is a big digital divide. It's huge, but through mobile phones particularly, and as those phones transition to being smartphones, and just look at Africa. After the World Cup came to South Africa, a cable was laid basically to provide 24/7 coverage of the World Cup to the rest of the world. But it was privately financed, 3/4 with African money, investment money. It was not a World Bank project. It was not philanthropy. And that pipeline being laid, now all the countries in East Africa are tapping into it and reducing the cost of internet access. So it's all happening right now.
So look into your digital crystal ball. Tell me how you think social media, the internet, the digital world might be harnessed to make these changes.
I guess there's a new book out called Too Big to Know by a guy at Harvard named David Weinberger. And he talks about what's the potential on the internet is to build what he calls a smart room. And we live in a world with too much information. Information is instantaneously available, and it's really hard to discriminate what's real from what's mythology. But if you have a smart room, if you have engagement and people sharing their ideas and their views, then you start to sort of discriminate where to go.
Andy Revkin, fascinating stuff. Thank you very much indeed for coming to the Daily Planet.
My pleasure.
Well, collaboration over social media and the internet is, by definition, very much an example of a bottom-up activity, with people taking power into their own hands. And people power is often hailed as the way ahead. And a good example can be found in Australia, where a remote local community has worked together to create and put into effect the country's first grassroots climate change adaptation plan. The people of the Eyre Peninsula to the west of Adelaide have been hit by droughts and bushfires, and they know that the area will get hotter and drier as global temperatures rise. It's an area where some 55,000 people are involved in farming, tourism, fishing and mining. Well, the chair of this groundbreaking Eyre Peninsula Integrated Climate Change Agreement, as it's known, is Brian Foster. And here's with me now. Brian, welcome to the Daily Planet. In a nutshell, what is the agreement?
The agreement is simply bringing the key regional stakeholders together with the state government to work towards developing an adaptation plan for the region, to look at the vulnerabilities and the adaptation options, if you like, but also to look at opportunity. So we'll see an expression of adaptation planning transferred to property planning and to land use planning, so that we can actually affect our whole of landscape, introduce carbon sequestration into that process, but sit it alongside productive agricultural use or food security. So we need to balance those two things.
And what was the driver for this? Was it a single individual charismatic leader, or was it the community talking to each other and coming together?
It's evolved over probably the last 20 years, and it came from a fairly serious drought in the early 90s. We simply brought the key community stakeholders or leaders together to deal with that drought. We then applied that principle to bushfire recovery in 2005 and to water security planning for the region. So it's really an iteration of what we were doing anyway, but formalising it in the context of climate adaptation.
And finally, because we're running out of time, what do you think it has achieved? What's been the concrete result?
It's about bringing the knowledge and understanding of climate to the regional community, so that, and not creating new networks, but using existing networks.
And it's making a difference.
It's making a difference, and it's bringing knowledge. And once people have knowledge, they become empowered.
Brian Foster, well, it sounds like a great project. Fascinating stuff. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's it for now on The Daily Planet. I'm back in just an hour and a half with more. We'll be talking stewardship of the planet with Georgina Mace, who spoke earlier this morning. And I'll be meeting the students whose voices delivered such a powerful reminder to the assembled delegates here that we only ever borrow the earth from our children. So join me at 12 noon UK time, but for now I hand you back to the main auditorium for a session that will be exploring the threats, conflicts and opportunities from changes in land use and ecosystem services. It's important stuff. Goodbye.